Hello, dear friends and colleagues. Welcome to this wonderful section on immunology. Today, we're going to review a special topic, something new in immunology, but very interesting. We're going to see the triangle between the brain, the gut, and the immune system. And to cover this beautiful seminar, we have a fantastic speaker. So welcome, Dirk. Welcome very much
Thank you
to
very
this,
much.
and thank you for coming. I'm going to introduce for you our speaker, Dirk Werlein. He is from Germany, at least he studied veterinary medicine in Hanover, but he has been moving on many different good places on immunology. He moved to study, first of all, as I said, in Hanover. Later he went to Zurich. Later from Zurich he go to England to work in Perrite, where he started to work in dendritic cell. Dendritic cells are part of the body of Dirk already. I noticed that this is one of the parts that you like more. He really enjoyed very much to do research and that, and go back later to Zurich. And finally, he went to Berna. He became professor in Berna. And at this moment, he is full professor and assistant dean of the Royal Veterinary College in London. So this is the persons that we have today, and I am sure you're going to enjoy a lot this talk. Welcome again, and Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. I'm trying to live up to that introduction, and I would like to tell you today about a really new area where I think we will see a lot of changes happening in the next years to come within veterinary medicine. And the area I'm talking about is what's now called the brain-gut immune system axis. So if you think about the current situation, then we estimate that we have more than 2 million kilograms of feed additives as antimicrobials being used on an annual basis. And this is only the figure for the US alone. However, despite all this prophylactic usage of antimicrobials, diseases are still pose the most significant economic risk and welfare risk, and also the welfare concerns to the farming industry. Now, if you think about this further, then pathogen elimination would be the most ideal way to control diseases. However, that's often unfeasible in today's farming industry. So what we need to do really is to work on different things to provide new approaches to remove predisposing factor associated with pathogens. And that could be the most practical method to control diseases. To do this, we have our immune system. And our immune system is really like a defense system guarding us against invaders. And just as we have an army, the Air Force, police, jails, and so on to keep us safe, the immune system has different branches which do different things, but coordinate that to protect our body from all invading pathogens. Now, all of you know that we can actually see immune responses, and I guess the classical symptoms of an immune response is what you see in a local effect. So we have, starting from the left, we have the heat, we have redness, we have swelling of the skin, for example, when we cut ourselves. Of course, we have pain, and in most cases, we have a loss of function. And to achieve this coordinated research, this coordinated approach, our immune system has different layers, and these layers are becoming more and more important when you think about that actually mounting an immune response requires energy. So what our body tries to do is improve our protection without spending too much unnecessary energy on that. So we have our mechanical barriers, such as mucosal surfaces, the skin, which are in addition flooded with antimicrobial peptides, with salts, with ions, and all of these should prevent that pathogen actually can interact with us. Then we have our innate immune system, the granulocytes, the macrophages, and the natural killer cells. And if you were born or raised in the 1980s, you may all remember this video game called Pac-Man, which is shown on this little black picture there, where this big yellow half moon was eating all the monsters in the game. And actually, our innate immune cells are more or less doing the same thing. They are the garbage removers. They are collecting all those things which are foreign to us and which we would like to get rid of. And only if the mechanical barriers and our innate immune system doesn't really work, then we're switching on our adaptive immune system. And here we have our classical T cells and B cells producing antibodies, providing help to B cells in form of the CD4 T cells, or trying to directly eliminate virus-infected cells, for example, in form of the CD8 killer cells. Now, what we learned in the last 5 years is that actually CD4 and CD8 is not the whole story. And just to give you an idea on how much the T cell side has expanded, I show you this slide. So in the middle you can see a naive T cell, and then depending on what transcription factors are activated or what cytokines these T cells produce, you can see that we have a whole variety of new T cell subsets. We have our classical T helper 2, Th2 cells in blue on top of the picture, and we have our T helper 1, Th1 cells in sort of green color on the left-hand side of the picture. However, we also know that based on the cytokines produced, we have a whole different set. We have T helper 9 cells producing mainly interleukin 9. We have T helper 17 cells mainly producing interleukin 17. And all these cells have a coordinated approach to fight infectious diseases. And this is something we have to take into account as well when we're designing new vaccines. But what also becomes more and more clear is that actually our T cells need a constant stimulation to stay alive. So on top you see the normal pathway where we have a naive T cell shown in pink, which gets driven by antigen exposure into an effector T cells. Then we have the contraction phase when the actual active threat is over, and we have the development of effector memory T cells, which then ripe or mature into central memory T cells. However, you can see also in the figures B and C that if these stimulating factors are not there, that the T cells undergo programmed cell death, apoptosis, and it really depends on the strength of the signal, whether or not we have the development of a central memory T cell pool. And this is actually very, very important for the development of vaccines, because this is what we actually want to achieve. Now, if you think about the immune system in this context, then the goal of the immune system is to keep you alive and to reproduce. And to do this, there's a constant arm race between each of us and the organisms around us. And with organisms around us, I don't only mean the pathogens, I also mean all those bacteria and viruses which we take up which don't cause any harm initially. However, what becomes clear is that we want to eliminate these foreign organisms without damaging ourselves, and the microbes on their own try to hang around as long as possible and reproduce themselves. And all of this should happen in a way that we are not spending too much energy on this. And energy expenditure is really, really a very important message. And this is my take-home message 1 for you. Mounting an immune response is energy consuming. What we know is that there is something like a vicious cycle of malnutrition. And what I'm showing you here is actually a malnutrition cycle generated by one of our epidemiologists working on human malnutrition. And you can see on top of this cycle the word malnutrition. That leads to impaired child development. It leads to compromised immunity. Compromised immunity leads to infection, which leads to disease, which leads to energy loss, which leads to reduced productivity, which leads to poverty, impaired development of education and health system, and so on. So malnutrition is a real big underlying issue in human health. However, this malnutrition is also a big underlying issue in our own production systems, where we have situations that pigs and calves are quite often not receiving the nutrition they need, especially in the first weeks of life, to maintain body weight growth as well as mounting an immune response. So if you think about this, any inflammatory reaction really requires energy. And this comes from the following scenario. So when we have an infection, we have macrophages, our garbage cells, producing immune modulators such as the cytokines interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor. And these factors work not only locally, but they also work systemically. They work on the liver, the brain, and the muscle. And what they induce here is an acute phase reaction, the shift from sugar preparation to usage of sugar. In the brain, they stimulate inappetence, so we're not eating that much, and fever. And in the muscle, they stimulate protein degradation because we still want to stay alive. And the energy that's consumed here is actually quite substantial. So for every degree we increase our body temperature, we need to raise our basic energy consumption by 15 to 30%. So 1 degree fever requires up to 30% more energy consumption. And this is quite a substantial amount, which not only means that we have to have the right nutrition, but we also have to be in the right mindset to actually want to eat this energy. And that's where things start getting wrong. Now, as I said already, we have in addition to the local effects, we have these systemic effects, and they are becoming more and more important. So we know that in the hypothalamus, we develop fever. In the liver, we have acute phase responses. And in the bone marrow, we're starting to mobilize more white blood cells. But what has that all to do with the cost of the immune response? There's not a lot of data out there, so let me start first by what's known from the human system. In the human system, we have our optional costs, which are our defense increase, but we may have to do this by reducing traits which get worse. The currency for these resources is energy intake, protein intake, minerals, and vitamins. So if our energy intake doesn't work, all the rest doesn't work either. And when you look at the system on the human side, then sepsis and injury, as well as vaccination, have a massive impact on energy turnover. So in vaccination, as a response of the vaccine, which is something we would like to have, the energy intake went up by 16%. And in sepsis, the energy or the metabolic rate went up by 57%. Now, that doesn't sound a lot, but if you turn this into the farm animal world, then the situation becomes more feasible and understandable for us. So in pigs, they showed that vaccination against PRRS virus reduces food intake by 15%. In chicken, they showed that if chicken have endotoxins circulating, coming from E. coli, for example, their body weight gain reduces by 13%. And lastly, in rat, they showed that if rats have a sepsis, so are really intoxicated with E. coli, their protein catabolism, so their protein usage or muscle usage, goes up by 40%. Now, if you put this into the context that we have a growing organism, such as a piglet or a calf, and they need to have the right energy to actually grow, but also need the energy to mount an appropriate immune response as a result of vaccination, for example, then it becomes clear that we cannot afford to malnutrient our animals. And in all of that, especially in pigs and calf, we have a critical window of immunological development, which is a transition phase from the maternal protection through maternal antibodies, going into the adaptive immune response, showing on the right-hand side as the blue triangle of the animal kicking in on its own. And all of these points are actually around the time point between birth and weaning. But between birth and weaning, we also have the colonization of the gut. So we're suddenly exposed to multiple and millions of bacteria which we haven't seen before. We need to develop some oral tolerance to these bacteria, and we also need to learn to establish an immune homeostasis. So you can imagine that something goes wrong in this time period, it will have massive impacts. Which brings me to my second take-home message. The normal mucosal architecture develops as a result of the colonization by commensal microbial flora. This is the case for more or less all mammalian animals. When we are born, we are, to 90% of the cases, completely sterile in us. And within the next couple of days of being born, we're actually getting exposed to trillions of bacteria. So when we start from the gut lumen on top of the slide, you can see we have the commensal bacteria, so those bacteria which should aid us in digesting our food. We have food antigens and we have pathogens. We have a mechanical barrier, which is the mucus layer, hopefully preventing that the pathogens get through. And we have the epithelial cell layer. Now, underneath the epithelial cell layer, we have a variety of immune cells, such as the macrophages, neutrophils, dendritic cells, T cells, and B cells. And these cells are constantly sampling our environment for two specific reasons. One is to deal with the pathogens, but the second reason is far more important, to train our immune system to not overreact to food antigens or commensal bacteria. So our intestinal immune system is really specialized to deal with huge antigenic loads coming into the gut. And you can measure this, or you can see that in the development of the mucosal immune system of the neonatal piglet. So at stage 1, when the pigs are born, we have rudimentary pairs petres, which are small numbers of mucosal antigen-presenting cells and T cells. Stage 2, about a day after being born to 2 weeks, we have a non-specific expansion of these pairs petres. We have more T cells and B cells coming in, which goes then into stage 3, 2 weeks to about 4 weeks, where we have the appearance of mature CD4 helper T cells, and finally stage 4, which is then from 4 weeks onwards, where we have the expansion of the B cell repertoire and the appearance of CD8 killer T cells. However, initially, the placenta of the pig and cow is impermeable to macromolecules, including immune globulins, antibodies, antimicrobial peptides. So everything the newborn has to come from the colostrum, as there's no exchange from maternally derived antibody or antigenic stimulation in the placenta. So everything has to happen within the first 6 hours after birth. And we also know that potentially due to this lack of exposure in the uterus, the fetal and neonatal animals use only a very limited set of antibody genes, which then subsequently starts expanding with age. So as I mentioned before, the driving force behind this immune system expansion is microbial exposure. And colleagues of mine in England have shown that if you restrict microbial exposure in early life, then that negates the immune benefits associated with gut colonization in an environment with high microbial diversity. Or put it in plain words, if you have too hygienic condition, it compromises the development of the normal gut microbiome. And this is something which we also can experience in humans. We have more and more children which are becoming allergic to substances they haven't been allergic to just because we're simply letting them wash their hands too often. We're washing every food they try to eat, even the dirty food, in quotation marks, from the street. So there is a drive that actually too sterile conditions are hampering the development of the normal gut flora as well as the normal development of the immune system. And the best example you can see is really the development of the paias patris. The paias patris are lymphoid follicle underlying the small intestine. They are part of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. They're mainly distributed in the jejunum, the ileum, and the duodenum. And you can see one of these paias patris circled here in red on the slide. But I think what is more important is if you look at the development of the paias patris from day 1 to day 35 in a little piglet. So if you start with the picture A, you can see the paias patris on the bottom of the picture in small circular structures. And these paias patris develop along the time to day 35, which is the slide or the picture marked with a K, into quite substantial lymphoid-like structures underlying the mucosal surfaces. And all this development is really driven by the intake of normal commensal microbiota. Now, what that also means is you can stain for these cells specifically. And here we have stained these paias patris with 2 antibodies. One is against a CD3 marker expressed on T cells on top in the top left corner. Underneath is the staining for CD21 as a marker for B cells in newborns or in a 12-day-old piglet, which are the 2 slides on the right-hand side. And you can see the massive influx of T cells and B cells, as well as the higher organization of these lymphoid-like structures appearing. So how do we avoid reaction to normal commensals of food antigens? And research in mouse and humans in the last couple of years has shown that we actually have tissue, so gut-resident macrophages, which are very good in not responding to food allergens or to commensal bacteria. What I'm showing you here on the left-hand side is a flow cytometry picture, and where you can see the green and the red cellular compartment. These are mature macrophages, and these have been shown to produce high amounts of the immunosuppressive cytokine interleukin-10, but they also have been shown to be resistant to stimulation of pattern recognition receptors. So those receptors we normally use to recognize bacteria. And the outcome of these mature macrophages is that our gut becomes hyporesponsive, so under-responsive to bacterial stimulation. That is very important for the regulatory function in the gut, and is very important to reduce local inflammation. It also means potentially that these macrophages spend their whole life in the intestinal tissues. They are non-migratory, but they can also modulate the T cell differentiation in the specific tissue. And what happens when the symbiosis between gut microbiota and immune system breaks down is shown on the next slide. So here you have inflammatory bowel disease, which is a dysregulated immune response directed against normal intestinal microbiota in genetically susceptible individuals. It can be in 2 forms, Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. We have similar diseases or pathological conditions occurring in pigs and in dogs. And what is important about this is it is not only a genetic susceptibility, but also that commensal microbacteria somehow show up at the wrong side of the tissue and leading to dysregulation of this macrophage response. So instead of the macrophages calming down our immune system, we now suddenly have an overshooting immune response which causes a lot more tissue damage than it actually should do. So we know now that commensal bacteria drive the development of the immune system, and this is driven by the microbiota. It also feeds back into how our brain reacts to that. But I think what is the most astonishing part, and this is data which were published in the last 2 years really, is that an early use of antibiotics orally or systemically has a long-lasting effect on the microbiome. So for example, a low-dose penicillin in early life induces long-term changes in the murine gut microbiota, in brain cytokine measurements, and therefore also in their behavior. More recently, it has been shown that parental antimicrobial administration in pigs impacts on the structure and the diversity of the fecal and nasal microbiota. So it is not only the microbiota in the gut which is affected, but also in other organs. And there's a marked response in the microbial community and metabolism in the ileum and cecum of suckling piglets after early antibiotic exposure. So early antibiotic exposure has a long-lasting and quite substantial effect on the normal gut flora. And by killing off this normal gut flora, it also leads to a wrong development of the immune system, potentially leading to the fact that our piglets and potentially other mammalian systems such as calves become suddenly susceptible to E. coli, to Salmonella, which then causes them to spend even more energy on mounting an immune response, which then affects their whole life system again. So if we restrict the microbial exposure in early life, then we clearly have immune benefits associated with gut colonization, even in environments with high microbial diversity. And all of this does not only affect the adaptive immune system, but also affects the innate immune system of an animal. So both sides of the immune response are targeted. Now, the question is the development of an age-specific gut microbiome important? And really, in a study shown by us, it is absolutely clear that this is important. Because what we found was that the lack of change of diet was identified as a risk factor on farm levels for the susceptibility to PCV2 infection. So if you had farms that changed their diet only twice over the period from birth to growers, they had more problems with PCV2 compared to farms which changed their diet 3 or 4 times. So that was quite surprising to us. And I think that brings me to my last take-home message, which is avoid any kind of stress in an animal. Stress causes a reduction in average daily weight gain, we know that. However, this is even enhanced when pathogens are present. So what you see here are mean average daily weight gains shown on the y-axis and the time in weeks on the x-axis. And the lowest line is those piglets that were stressed by high stocking density, high temperature, and the presence of PCV2. Whereas the highest lines, or the best average daily weight gain, was our control group. And you can see there's a clear impact on these stresses on the average daily weight gain. And indeed, this stress does not only reduce the average daily weight gain, it also aids the replication of PCV2 in the serum, or the presence of PCV2 in the serum. And astonishingly, again, this mainly happens around week 3, when the maternal antibodies are going down and the own antibodies are not there yet. And this is not only the case in the serum, but it's also the case in the tissue. So if you look at the y-axis, this is PCV copy numbers per nanogram of cDNA in the tissue, and you can see that in those conditions where we have virus, high stocking density, and high temperature present, we have a higher PCV2 copy numbers. And you can not only see that on the cDNA level, but you can also stain for PCV2. On the left-hand side, you can see those piglets which were infected by PCV2, and you can see that this is mainly replicating in the ileum, in the intestine, whereas our control animals on the right-hand side have hardly any PCV2 staining. But it is very important to know that this is actually very dependent on the pathogen. So there are not many studies out there describing the impact of environmental stress on pathogen replication under defined and controlled conditions. So for example, there was no effect seen on the average daily weight gain in the presence of bacteria, that was E. coli, Salmonella and Brachyspira, or viruses at 3-week post-weaning. However, there was an enhanced colonization of IgA-specific B cells in the intestine of rotavirus vaccinated and challenged animals. So it clearly depends on what pathogen we're dealing with. So why is the stress so detrimental? It really comes down to the axis I mentioned before, the key brain-gut interaction involving the immune system. So if you look at the top of the picture, you see our brain. Then underneath, you see the gut microbiota and the intestinal surfaces. And you see underneath that all the immune responses going back. What is the important part is that underneath this layer are the mesenteric nerves in the mesenteric plexus on the longitudinal muscles. And all of these feed back directly into the brain, as well as the brain feeding back to the immune system in the vicinity of the mesenteric plexus. And depending on this interaction, we either get the right immune response or we get an aberrant immune response being produced. So the consequences are stress can impact on pathogen replication, diminishes the immune response through immune suppression. We believe that the majority of this comes from cortisol, which is produced as part of brain activation. So please keep our stress low and husbandry optimal. Now, if I want to summarize what I tried to get through to you today, then I think that preventive vaccination rather than antibiotic usage is far more appropriate way to reduce energy expenditure due to stimulation of the immune system in the response of infection. When we treat our animals, we really need to think about the potential damage antibiotic usage can do to the brain-gut immune system axis, as the disruption of this intestinal microbiota with antibiotic usage primes macrophages to respond inappropriately to microbial stimulation. And what I haven't shown you is that even when we repopulate a gut with microbiota following antibiotic usage, we still have infiltration of inflammatory monocytes, enhanced inflammatory cytokine production by macrophages, and the whole repopulation takes actually a very long time, and even in the best case scenario may not reset the microbiome to the situation we had before the antimicrobial usage. And with that, I thank you for your attention, for listening. I hope that my explaining makes you think about how and when we should use antimicrobials in veterinary medicine and whether there are other ways forward to maintain animal welfare. And I'm quite happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk. We have several questions.
Cool.
Yeah, so we have work.
Excellent.
I hope you like it. Let's go. There are many. I will try to see if we can answer to all the questions.
Yeah.
One of the first questions that we have here is, how important do you think are maternal antibodies to interference and vaccine?
Yeah. So that is a long-standing dispute, really, whether maternal antibody do interfere with newborn vaccination. Mm-hmm. And so far, we mainly measured antibody production in the serum of the newborn as a marker for whether a vaccination was successful or not. And if the serum antibody titer did not go up, we said, no, the vaccination didn't work. What becomes clear now is that even the antibody titer may not go up, the vaccination of the newborn primes the T cells and B cells of the newborn to respond faster and more efficient once the maternal antibodies are gone and the pathogen comes along. So even in the case we do not see a direct effect on antibody titers, the immune system of the newborn is pre-primed to mount the most appropriate response when the pathogen comes along.
That's very interesting. So they don't block.
They don't. Well,
that's important because people thinking it's a block.
Yes.
And that.
I think the problem we have there is that we have so far only used a limited set of markers to say whether or not a vaccine actually works.
Yeah.
And I think that through systems we know in human medicine, but also the development of new technologies we have made in veterinary medicine, it becomes clear that there's actually a lot more going on than we know. We just need to find the right marker now to say, yes, this vaccination has worked or not.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, let's go. We have more here. He said, good afternoon. What do you think of the human consumption of animal that have not received any colostrum antibodies? Could the human do something when you, for any reasons, the animal cannot eat or drink the colostrum?
No.
What can we do, the human, I mean the vets or the farmers,
Yeah.
to help that situations?
So no colostrum is really a bad situation. Yeah, there's enough evidence out there, and it's not only to do from the immune system side, it's also from the nutrient side. So as a rule of thumb, you can say the optimal situation would be around, in a calf, about 4 liter colostrum in the first 4 hours of life. If you can't do that, then use any colostrum you may have frozen down from the same farm, and you can at least reduce the number of pathogens in the gut.
I see.
So you reduce the number of pathogens because the antibodies are there. You may not get the uptake of the antibodies out of the colostrum into the calf anymore, but at least they have still a local effect.
So in all cases, they should provide
Yes.
any kind of colostrum.
Yes. There are a lot of dried colostrum products in there, which people claim you can add to the calf. I'm always a bit dubious about this because the colostrum contains the antibody of the local environment. And if I think that the colostrum I'm buying was produced, just say, in Norway,
Yeah.
then the pathogens there may be very different compared to the pathogens you have on a Spanish farm.
I see.
Yes, there will be some cross-reactivity, but whether they are, for that farm, really the right antibodies, that is always a question.
Very good.
So I think it would be better to store colostrum,
Yeah.
to freeze it and give it, whenever you can, rather than giving no colostrum from the farm.
That's a good advice. Thank you, Dirk. We have more here. Let me see. The human immune response. That's interesting. What do you think is the cost of, you mentioned in your talk that vaccinations or any infections have some energy cost.
Yes.
And the guy here asked, do you think that the cost in vaccinations, depending of the vaccine, or in general,
No.
is all related, similar cost?
Let's start different. If you compare the energy cost to a vaccination compared to the energy cost to full-blown infectious disease, there's no doubt that the amount of energy you spend on the immune response for a vaccine is cost beneficial.
Absolutely.
Yeah? Now, do different vaccine induce different energy expenditure? Probably very likely. It depends whether they are inactivated vaccines, which quite often have an adjuvant in there, whether they are live attenuated vaccine, which potentially persist a bit longer in the animal compared to the inactivated vaccines. So yes, you will have different energy expenditure to a vaccine, to different vaccines. But again, I have to stress that that energy expenditure is still nothing compared to the energy expenditure you have if your calf suffers from a rotavirus infection and subsequent E. coli infection.
Very good. That's a good question too. This guy asked if you recommended the vaccines combined with vitamins or any other products that can increase the energy of the animals when you vaccinate.
Yes. I think that really depends on the farm again. So I don't think you can give a blanket check and saying You know, if you use that combination of vaccine and that combination of vitamins, that works for every farm the same way, because we have dairy farms, we have feedlot farms, we have Holstein Friesian on the dairy farm, we have Black Angus, Hereford. So the situation on the farm as well as the genetic of the animal has a real impact on this. So giving a blanket recommendation is really not the best.
Yeah.
So what I would suggest is that the person who did ask a question speaks to the vet on their farm as well as the food supplier to maximize what they can achieve with the products they have available.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not a single recipe.
No.
It's depending on many,
Exactly.
many factors. And it's better that they ask with the nutrition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Let me see here. They said, in your opinion, what is the early age where we should stop the antibiotic treatment?
What do you mean with
He said that the early age where antibiotics should be avoided.
Oh, okay. So in the best world scenario, I would say avoiding antibiotic treatment in the first 3-4 weeks of life is really, really essential. Now, I'm completely aware that this is under normal production very hard to achieve. But we should strive for that. And the reason why I am really a firm believer in that we don't have to use, or that we shouldn't use antibiotics, is that one of my colleagues in England, Claire Woffers, has shown very nicely that if calves are treated very early on in their life with antibiotics, it actually has a long-lasting impact. So these calves normally come into the first estrus later. They have a lower average daily weight gain. Because they come into estrus later, the farmers spend more money on them. Quite often, the heifers and cows resulting from such calves have higher production diseases such as respiratory diseases or mastitis or endometritis, which means that their milk production goes down, which means that these animals disappear from the farm earlier.
I see.
And what we believe at the moment is that the effect of this long-lasting effect of antimicrobials is coming from something called epigenetics. So the interaction of the environment with the genes we are activating. Now, if you put this back into the calf system, if the calf microbiota is not correct and you have a aberrant immune response being developed, you get different genes being switched on. And that has a long-lasting effect into the adulthood as well. And I think that is really the crucial part, that we need to maximize our efforts to get calves and piglets through the early phases in life without using antibiotics. And in quotation mark, you could say a simple way is to optimize animal management. You know, clean out the boxes,
Absolutely.
keep the animals clean and all that, and it should work.
So, in summary, what you recommended is that earlier to stop with antibiotic, much better.
Yeah.
As early in the stage.
Exactly. So what really currently our academic beliefs are is that try to avoid early antibiotic usage, optimize animal husbandry, and vaccinate as soon as you can vaccinate. Build up a herd immunity so that all animals in the herd are protected, and then maintain this vaccination schedule even you have no disease on the farm.
I see.
Because what may happen is that as soon as you stop vaccinating, pang, your disease comes back.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you very much. We have a few more questions, but we are out of time.
We can do
I
one
would
more?
Like one question more?
One
That's
more?
Good.
Okay.
These guys are fantastic. They give us an extra one. Okay, how do you deal with the early diarrhea in young pig? That is more than 1 minute.
Okay. Yes. That is an answer where we can probably spend the whole evening on. I don't know. It's a short answer. I really don't know. I know that this is a real issue in the pig industry. I know that in England there's a lot of work going on using probiotics, for example, like Bifidus, which can break down colostrum and therefore provide the right energy. And again, I think that enabling piglets to suckle as soon as possible after birth and keeping them warm and all that, so to minimize all other energy expenditure, may help to prevent the disease severity. It may not prevent completely the disease occurrence. And I think this is something we also need to think about, this, that in a herd we always have a normal distribution. We have animals which will not become ill, we will have animals which become a bit ill, and we have the right side of the normal distribution, which is those animals which become severely ill.
Yeah. So again, energy and stress,
Yes.
two important points.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's probably the two big points
Yes.
of that.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Dick.
You're most
really
welcome.
was fantastic.
Thank
We
you.
enjoy, I am sure our friends enjoy very much. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good day or a good evening or whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.